So on Friday, my heart was really lifted to see so many of us who got to go and join with another congregation in the area, the Highland Park Presbyterian Church, and we did a joint Tenebrae service. Many of you were there, and Tenebrae is, of course, the service that marks Good Friday. And it's a very somber service because what happens is that as each reading in the gospel is done, the lights in the place dim. And then at the very end, we aren't kind of left on a message of hope. Instead, we're left in the darkness, we're left with silence, we're left with all that is unresolved in our hearts, just kind of sitting there and sitting with all of that. It's an opportunity to grieve for all that is happening in the wider world, all of the painful things that we see. It's an opportunity to think about the painful things that we may be carrying as we tell an ancient story and engage in a liturgical act together. And what struck me this year as I was reading that text, and this is what I preached on at that service if you weren't there, I talked about the silence that is in the text, and specifically the silence of anyone to speak up and speak out against the injustice that was happening in the text. We see Jesus being convicted and then executed, and no one lifts a voice. Pilate doesn't lift his voice to say, I'm not going to condemn an innocent man. There's no one in the crowd that lifts a voice in protest. The disciples, Jesus's friends, they do not lift a voice. Instead, they are silent and they flee. And I'm thinking about how, as a Unitarian Universalist, I so want to see stories and read stories in which voices are lifted, in which people call out for change, in which people do protest. That's such a deep part of who we are and what our religious tradition holds and celebrates. And then to read a story like that, in which no one does it, there is a particular poignancy and a particular pain in that. Now, the understanding of a Tenebrae service, of a Good Friday service, is that what will happen on Easter is that there will be an uplift, there will be resurrection, there will be new life. Good Friday doesn't put the punctuation mark on it, right? Which would be more of a period, not an exclamation at that point. But the story continues. The story continues with Easter. But as I was lingering in the foyer with some of our members, and then afterwards we went out to dinner, a couple of people mentioned to me, it's a shame that we Unitarian Universalists don't get an Easter. We're just sort of stuck on Good Friday. And it is true in some ways. We don't have some kind of developed theology about the resurrection of the body. We don't have some idea that Jesus is lifted from the grave and then sits at the right hand of God the Father and all of that. Like that's some of us do. Some of us do hold a theology like that. We are a pluralistic faith. But for many of us, that kind of theology doesn't resonate. And so I've been thinking these last couple of days, what are we to make of Easter? How are we to think of Easter? How are we to think about resurrection? Can we name it and lift it and think about it at all? When I was 16 years old, I worked for this man who, his name was Worley Rodehaver. I'll never forget Worley. And he was an older guy. This was, what he was doing in post-retirement. There was this brief moment for me where I thought, I might want to be a journalist. Now, there are doors in my past that are now closed that I regret and wish were still open. That's not one of them. Totally respect journalism in that, but it's just not for me. And I think a part of that was I got to be with Worley. He had multiple papers in these different neighborhoods of Cincinnati, and he would send me out to be this reporter, and I would get to sit in on these community meetings, and sometimes I'd be sitting there for like 3 hours listening to a debate about whether to tear down a building and put a park in a neighborhood. And I think it might have been that experience that made me think, I think I'm good. This isn't for me. Worley also published the LGBTQ Times in Cincinnati. It was the only... I'm sorry, what, Marge?
When did he start that?
He started it later in life. So Worley was, post-retirement age at this point. I was 16 at that point, working with Worley on this. So he had the LGBTQ Times, and he started publishing that later in life after he came out, which happened for him later in life. And I think we had this really deep mutual respect for each other. I had come out when I was 14 years old, and that for him was unfathomable. And I think he respected the courage that it took to do that. And I respected him because he didn't come out until much later in life. And he lived a life in which he kept who he was to himself for all of those years. Sometimes he had relationships with women. I can't remember if he was married and then later divorced, or if that was a part of his story. It's a little bit hazy for me right now. But what I do know is that until he was in his 60s, he never told anyone about his story, about who he really was. It was a part of himself that he kept quiet, that was locked in the silence of his heart. And so in afternoons, we would gather around this newsprint, and we would actually physically cut and paste articles and glue them on. Does anybody remember doing this? Okay, yeah, this was the old way to do it. This was before the sort of sophisticated technology came out. So as we were doing that, I would ask him questions sometimes about his life. And I asked him what it was like to be closeted all those years, to have that as a secret that he alone was holding. The metaphor he told me was so exquisitely painful, I've never forgotten it. He said it was a lot like having an illness, a sickness, and you know that there's a cure, but it's on another continent, an ocean away, and there is no boat that can take you there. And to be clear, the illness was not being gay, the illness was being closeted and being unable to share that with anyone. There was an illegibility to his life. There was no way that others could understand, that he felt others could understand who he was. He could barely even articulate it to himself. And there was such a deep pain and a deep silence that was appended to that. And so one day I asked him, Worley, what was it like when you finally found the courage to share who you are? And he told me another thing that has stuck with me all these years. He said it was like my world opened up and everything became possible. My world opened up and everything became possible. What is a Unitarian Universalist theology of resurrection if it's not that? If it's not the idea that out of silence, grief, pain, heartache, out of the secrets that we carry in our heart, out of all of the things that weigh us down and that are burdens to us, that sometimes hope can break through. Sometimes there can be this luminous blooming of life that comes forth. Sometimes we are not stuck in the silence. Sometimes that hope becomes quite loud. It becomes quite loud. My spiritual companions, I don't know what it is that you're carrying in your heart today. I know it could be all sorts of worries for what's happening in the wider world. I carry plenty of those. It can be personal estrangements and heartbreaks and broken relationships too. It can be depressions, it can be addictions. I know all of that stuff exists inside of our hearts. What I also know, to the fiber of my being, and my viscera, my blood, my bones, is that sometimes resurrection is possible, sometimes that hope breaks forth, sometimes new life comes and we do find resurrection. And when we find that, let us celebrate it. Let us savor it. Let the voice that was silent turn into a shout.